Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the VSI webinar series. Today, Dr. Ian Lawrence, author of Football Management, Football Club Management, and Senior Business Lecturer and Sports Industry Consultant, will be talking to Professor Ellis Cashmore and David Murray. At a time when football authorities are discussing if, how, and when the current football season will resume, an article by Matthew Syed in today's Times titled, "Is it fair to put lives at risk for football? On the balance, yes," has been introduced to the market. This leads nicely into this evening's debate. VSI will be talking about, is football behind closed doors testament to greed or perfect to lift a nation? While some have stated sport is not important in these times, many believe sport is the fabric of communities around the world. And with expert knowledge this evening across sociology, sports rights, and management structures across sports organisations, to this evening's discussion will aim to position an educated and considered why football and other sports should endeavour to find its way back into society. Before handing over to Ian Lawrence, who will host proceedings, Tim Coates will explain how those of you on the panel can ask various questions. Tim, over to you.
Thank you, Tony. So if you're lucky enough to be on the panelists and you're a delegate in the our studio audience, then you can ask questions, and we'd wish you to do that via the chat box at the bottom. So if you just type them in there, we will pick them up and ask those questions at the end. We'll only pick 2 or 3, so make them good questions. If you're watching this live on YouTube, you cannot ask questions because we've turned the comments off. So you may still be charged for those, and I'm joking, you will not be able to get those, won't come through. Literally just pick up and enjoy that series. So without further ado, I can hand this over to Ian, who's going to kick us off royally.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. My name is Dr. Ian Lawrence. I'm a senior lecturer in sport business at Teesside University Business School. My work as a researcher and business consultant focuses mainly upon elite sport, and in particular professional football. And it's the world of professional football that we're focusing upon today with our 2 great guests. The broad title for the discussion is Football Behind Closed Doors, but inevitably we'll probably talk and touch on a range of different leadership, commercial, governance, and potentially issues surrounding ethics. So we're not necessarily going to be restricted to the pressing issues surrounding the Premier League, but we're going to focus on that for a big chunk of the conversation. And as Tim says, please send in any questions you have and we'll try and get to them at the end of the discussion. So to follow on from what Tony said at the head of the presentation today, a couple of further introductions about our guests, Ellis and David. First things, Ellis. I'd like to welcome Ellis Cashmore, Honorary Professor of Sociology at Aston University. His career has taken him from studying as an undergraduate in the leafy glades of Northumberland to holding prestigious academic roles in Toronto, Washington, Hong Kong, and Tampa, Florida. Tampa must have been a tough gig. Ellis is a prolific writer and has published some of the most cited works on topics as diverse as race, class, contemporary pop culture, including books on the Kardashians, Elizabeth Taylor, David Beckham, and Mike Tyson. And one of Ellis's classic texts is arguably his meticulously researched book, Making Sense of Sports, which I think is now in its 5th edition. It's a key text in understanding the origins, development, current state of sport. Ellis's original research also extends to analysis of our screen society, in which he and his co-authors coined the term screen ages, which I'm sure Ellis will drop in a few mentions of when we get to meet him in a second. It's a great book which challenges the perceived problems associated with society's ever-increasing use of our mobile devices. Secondly, last but not least, we've got David Murray. David is a chartered accountant by trade with over 25 years worth of experience in broadcast media. Spent 14 years at the BBC where he was head of sports rights. That meant he had responsibility for negotiating deals with a host of world-leading sports rights holders, including the International Olympic Committee, UEFA, FIFA, Premier League, Formula One, Six Nations, and Wimbledon. 6 years ago, David and a colleague launched their own sport business consultancy called Fosmos. In addition to all of those responsibilities, David works as a broadcast and negotiation consultant for Shoesmiths, one of the UK's foremost law firms, And in addition, David teaches negotiation at University of Liverpool and Salford. So, long-winded introduction from me. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of what we're going to talk about today. Let's begin with a few facts. According to the latest statistics from the ONS, more than 33,000 people have died of COVID-19 so far in the UK, and that's probably underestimated. So whilst detailed international comparisons are problematic, our official death total in the UK is the highest in Europe, second highest in the world. Ministers are being told that people in the UK are catching the virus at a rate of 20,000 per day. So in the face of this pandemic, Ellis, what are your thoughts on how Number 10 has handled the crisis so far?
I think that they've terrified us. I think that we are in the grip of a panic that is not necessarily a rational response to what is obviously a pandemic. As you said earlier, we can't always trust statistics. In fact, I never trust them, but that's all we've got to go on at the moment. And I think that our response to it has been near hysterical. Obviously, we have a growing death rate, but we've also got a prime minister who has been led by the nose by a bunch of scientists who really don't seem to know what they're doing, who are basing all their forecasts on a model, which, to my way of thinking, is a heuristic and not a reflection of reality, and thus far has not proved in any way a reliable guide to what we should be doing. In other words, what the model forecast hasn't come true. That's my response to what the government is doing. I thought we were going to talk about football, though.
We'll get to it. Don't worry, we've got time to get into it. I just thought we'd start off with first things first. David, what are your thoughts on crisis management?
To a large extent, I agree with Ellis, actually. I hope I'm not going to be like Nick Clegg and say that continuously throughout the broadcast. I think the government started with the view that we'll go down what's now known as the sort of Swedish model, which is to try and seek broader herd immunity, but was pressured by various interests and various statistical models into panicking slightly. Now, I wouldn't claim to be an expert on this, but whichever country you look at, the infection rate seems to follow a broad pattern, and Sweden's, who haven't locked down to the extent we have, is not dramatically different to ours despite the lockdown. And having gone down that initial kind of let's just social distance and see how it goes, the government was forced, for whatever reason, to change tack towards lockdown. And as Ella said, the way to enforce that lockdown was to simply scare people to death. So we've now got a situation where nobody wants to go outside because they think, if I catch this, I'm going to die. If you look at the statistics, it's the deaths, which are all, by the way, I'm not in any way diminishing the seriousness of the situation and the people who've died. But the deaths are very much skewed towards the likes of us looking around the screen, the sort of older men, and generally people with underlying health conditions. So to lump everybody into the same boat, and we'll come on to this when it comes to sport as well, when the younger you are and the fitter you are, the lower the risk of any kind of complications or even noticing any symptoms. So that needs to be taken into consideration. Saying all that, the government went into this lockdown almost being pushed into it without really understanding how they were ever going to come out of it. And my fear is, we're not going to want to come out of this until there's a no risk solution, and that's just not going to be possible, unfortunately.
It was interesting, before we get into the focus on football, just as a sideline, I'm not sure whether you've come across some of the media broadcasts from Sir David Spiegelhalter, who's a statistician and fellow at Churchill College in Cambridge. Incidentally, when I Googled his name, I found out that Spiegelhalter apparently is German for mirror holder. And he's using this phrase, number theatre, Ellis. which is interesting. Talking about statistics, and there are lies, damn lies, and statistics.
Yeah.
There seems to be an appetite from the general public for information. Is it a missed opportunity in terms of how these statistics are being presented?
Well, I'm not even sure, that the statistics are reliable, because they're recorded, so I understand. And, I'm prefacing everything I say with "so I understand," because I'm not a statistician, and I'm not even a quantitative sociologist. I did, spent a life doing qualitative research. So stats are anathema to me. But my understanding is that different countries record the deaths and the cases of COVID-19 in different ways. So we're comparing apples with oranges in some cases. So I'm not even sure that they are at all reliable. But I think that the opportunity that was missed, as far as I can see, is, we referred to Sweden earlier, and that is the no panic solution. In other words, let's just try not to treat the population of the UK as children who are going to disobey everything we tell them. Let's reverse this and try them a different way. We will tell you the dangers. We think this is a virus that is transmitted through the air. It can jump 6 feet, 2 meters, and that requires us to keep that suitable distance between each other. So we're going to help you. We're going to issue guidelines to places of public resort, including sports gatherings, and we're going to put limits on some of them, but we're going to expect you to toe the line as well. So join us in preventing the spread of this virus. And by the way, we'll leave the economy intact, we'll leave the shops open, we'll leave businesses running, we'll try to let life go on as normal. And I think that that's an interesting approach from Sweden's perspective, because although they've suffered a little bit economically, they have not been devastated as we have been. And their death rate is proportionately not too bad compared to ours.
David, what do you think is going on? You've got great experience in terms from a commercial, from a professional perspective, working with rights holders. What will be going on behind the scenes right now in terms of those conversations?
Well, first of all, a lot of sports are in a very difficult place at the moment because they have no income coming in, be that crowds, ticket sales, or be it broadcast revenue. I know there are a number of conversations going on at the moment between the broadcasts and the various sports, trying to pick through the bones of this and work out, well, we have a contract which is based on you delivering certain content. You're clearly not going to deliver that, or you're not going to deliver it at the time it was promised, or in the form it's promised, i.e. with a crowd and an atmosphere. How much will we actually pay you versus how much does the contract say? And that's, that could be a significant amount, a significant proportion. For instance, if you look at a sport, say like cricket, which has a potential for its entire season to be wiped out, that would be a whole year's worth of income for them. If you look at football, it's in a slightly different position because they got most of the season in before the season was paused. So there's a fundamental question for football and the broadcasters as to how do we wrap this up? How do we draw the season to a halt in a meaningful way? I think most people now think, well, just making the season null and void is not helpful when it comes to securing broadcast income. Or do we try and finish the season, which seems to be the way the Premier League and certainly the government is encouraging sports like the Premier League to go? I think cricket is very different because it needs to try and have some sort of season. No doubt we'll come on to this in a minute, but should football be looking at trying to finish this season or get everything in place to start fresh at the beginning of August when it would have started anyway? And we're the longer the delay, the more we run into the risk that this season is stopped.
Well, I think we'll drill down into the Premier League and implications of what's being proposed, and that's very much, it's a dynamic area at the moment. Things are changing by the day, but I'm interested as well in broadening the discussion to what seems to be quite a confused picture. When we think about the advice that we're receiving regarding recreation and keep fit, and there almost seems to be a bit of a dichotomy being created between professional and recreational sport. And it becomes even more complex when you think about the implications of how things can move forward for team activities versus individual, indoor versus outdoor. You know, I was looking through some of the recommendations this morning, and after what seems to be further confusion from number 10, a little bit of clarity is emerging in that from today, all outdoor sports facilities will be open with the exception of open air swimming pools. People will be able to exercise with someone from outside of their households, which I guess is great for personal trainers and coaches. The only catch is that the social distancing guidelines are still going to have to be rigorously enforced. And the picture becomes, I think, even more complicated for organizations such as gyms, sports centers. Well, obviously, they've got great concern about their balance sheets because they have no membership subscriptions coming through. They've got no revenue in that respect. Meanwhile, landlords are still going to be demanding that they pay rent. And it seems to be that within this crisis, there's an opportunity for us to maybe look at physical activity, recreation, amateur sport, whatever we want to call it. Is the government doing enough, Ellis, in terms of addressing what is the sport is passionately embraced by the length and breadth of the UK, but are we doing enough in terms of grassroots, in terms of how we're going to move out of lockdown?
Well, I think the government is looking through the wrong end of the telescope, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, what it could have done is say, okay, what sports and recreations are dangerous? And clearly the ones where people are rubbing shoulders, coming into physical proximity by necessity, we've got to do something about those. But you mentioned gyms earlier. Now, as you pointed out, most gyms are commercial. And so they have no income at all. They haven't for 2 months now. And it strikes me as fairly simple to issue guidelines to gyms and say, okay, we'll measure your square footage and come up with a calculation to tell you how many people maximum you can let in the gym at any one time. We will issue guidance on how to space out, put tape down or cordon off certain areas so that people don't come within that 2 meter distance of each other. And it strikes me as, all of us guys who are gathered here today could come up with a pretty sophisticated plan given 30 minutes. But the government is looking from the other end of the telescope and saying, no, all these places are locked down now. So which ones can we allow open? In other words, rather than let us think these things through ourselves, they're imposing a lockdown on us and then almost grudgingly allowing a little bit to escape, a little bit, easing as they call it, bit by bit, and through these tiny increments. Whereas, as I said, my philosophy is exactly the opposite. Only restrict people's behavior when it's absolutely necessary.
So this kind of touches on civil liberties, doesn't it, I suppose?
I think it does. And I think that this is one of the greatest impositions on British civil liberties in history, I suppose. Certainly nothing in my lifetime approaches this. And, just reading what other people have written historically, it's very difficult to find any kind of parallel in history. And the interesting feature about this is there is so little resistance. People are saying, good on Johnson, good on him. In fact, we want it extended. But this goes back to the point that I made initially. It's because we're terrified. I have neighbors around here who haven't seen the light of day for 2 months now. They just won't go out at all. And they have relatives who respect that and talk to them through the window. And, I kind of break it to them very gently. This isn't absolutely necessary because unless you are in a certain demographic group or have an underlying health condition, the probability is that you will live through this. You may catch, some symptoms here and there, but you'll probably live through it. So this is an eminently survivable virus.
David, what do you think?
The thing that concerns me about just focus and we'll come on to the professional side of things, but the thing that concerns me about just focusing on professional sport and ignoring, to a large extent, grassroots sport is, I suppose, the fundamental question: what is sport all about? For me, sport, elite sport, as well as entertainment, is about participation and the health and well-being benefits of getting as many people active as possible. Now, we've already said that that there's clear linkage between those who are suffering complications from COVID and their health. There's a clear link between obesity and people who die. Yeah. And yet we've shut down most of the activities that allow people to play sport and be active, and that just seems like a massive contradiction. Now, I'm someone with two young kids, 14 and 12, who are really into their sport and at a decent level, and yet kids are not able to play sport when they're not at any real risk of suffering from COVID. So surely it's not beyond the wit of man to come up with some ways that at least we could get kids back playing sport, because they're under no risk, virtually no. They're more likely to get run over by a bus than die from COVID. So we need to be thinking about the health and well-being benefits of bringing back sport. It's a bit like the damage to the economy, but no one's thinking about the damage to the nation's health. And being locked up in a house for weeks and weeks on end without any real physical activity is, I'm not going to say is more damaging than 30-odd thousand people dying from COVID, but it's pretty damaging. And the longer this goes on, the worse it will become. And then, sorry, I'll finish in a minute, but we're in danger of losing a whole generation to sport here, because you take teenagers out of sport for a year and there's no guarantee they're going to go back again. It's hard enough to get them interested in activity without having a year's hiatus.
I don't know whether either one of you came across the quote from Steve Parish, who's been on quite a few news outlets in the last few days, over the weekend certainly. And the quote that I liked from him was that football is meaningless, but it's magnificently meaningless. Does that kind of encapsulate, Ellis, the debate regarding football at the moment? Is that football is important in the grand scheme of things?
Well, it isn't. No, I don't think it is. I'm listening to your question carefully. You say in the grand scheme of things, it isn't.
Yeah.
It's trivial and it's pointless. And as you said earlier, Steve Parish says it's meaningless, and magnificently so, but meaningless. So I would have to say that, football doesn't make that much difference. Someone asked me the other day, are people champing at the bit to get football back? And I said they're probably more concerned about whether they've got a job to go back to and how they're going to pay the mortgage, rather than whether football's coming back. So I think in terms of our personal priorities, football is pretty low, which is not to say that there isn't an appetite to get it back, because I'm sure that there is. And there's a lot of people out there who do want to see professional football played again. And there really isn't any, and I know I'm jumping the gun a bit here, but I don't think there is really any technical obstacle to doing exactly that. I think we could bring football back, and safely so. Just to go back to your original question, I'm certainly not exaggerating the importance of football at a time like this now.
David, in terms of, throwing another quote from Simon Jordan, he contrasts that with saying that considering any kind of return is tantamount to corporate manslaughter. What's your perspective?
Well, I'll answer that question and the previous one as well, if I may. Throwing terms around like corporate manslaughter, I think, is a bit irresponsible and only adds to this paranoia that if you step outside, you're going to die. If you take a bunch of young, healthy athletes and put in proper screening facilities or proper social distancing, then the risk is minimal. It's not you're not throwing them to the wolves, so to speak, and we've got to try and shake that sort of perception off. But just as far as the importance of sport, I guess football or sport, I come at it from a slightly different perspective to Ellis, in that sport is one of the major industries in this country. It's a bit like saying, restaurants aren't important, pubs aren't important. Any, travel, hospitality, all these industries that represent a huge chunk of our economy. Okay, they're not important when it comes to life or death, but they're absolutely part of the fabric of our society and our culture. And for a lot of people, they're what makes life worth living. If you take all of that away, then you're taking a big chunk out of the economy. And if you applied that logic to every sector of the economy, there wouldn't be very much left apart from the health and public services. In my view, we're about more than that. So it's about trying to get things in perspective here, which talks of corporate manslaughter don't help in any way. How do we get things back to normal, or semi-normal as quickly as possible? Because if we stay locked down in our caves for too much longer, there's not going to be anything to come back to. In which case, it won't really matter whether it's important or not, because it won't be there anymore.
Ellis, I don't know whether you've managed to come across Matthew Side's article that Tony mentioned at the top of the discussion today. Have you been able to come across it?
Yes.
Okay. What's your take on it? Because it's a very provocative titled heading to the article that he has, where he's talking about, yes, we don't live in a risk. We live in a risk-averse society, but we can never completely eradicate risk. So yes, players should be motivated to start playing ASAP. What's your take on that?
Well, I don't really care, to be honest, if they play or not. I mean, this is, for me, it's an interesting discussion, but I have no axe to grind. I'm not, I analyze these things. I'm not in love with football particularly, and it wouldn't bother me if I didn't see another game as long as I live, to be honest. The least interesting facet of football for me is the 90 minutes after the whistle blows. But I am interested in all the racism, the skullduggery, the corruption, the sexism, the violence, everything that goes with football. That's the kind of stuff that I'm interested in. But I largely agree with Saeed, because I think that there is a risk in any sport. I come from a boxing background. And for me, in my preparation, just putting my thoughts together for this discussion, I was thinking, is there any greater risk involved in playing 90 minutes of football at the moment than there would be doing 12 rounds of boxing at any time in history? And the answer is probably not. Boxing is just a dangerous sport, but so is marathon running. I don't think the risk is any greater for a footballer than a marathon runner. And the reason for saying this, and I know, our viewers are probably screaming at the top of their heads now and saying how irresponsible I am. Look at what statistics we have. Okay, I've already said that I don't think that they're necessarily reliable, but it's all we've got to go on at the moment. And the percentage of deaths of people under the age of 39 is less than 1%. Now, if you take another chunk of those deaths away for people who have underlying health conditions and then accidents on top of that, it leaves you a very, very small percentage. And to my knowledge, are there any over 40-year-olds playing in the Premier League? I don't know, honestly, but I doubt it. So if they're all under 39, none of them have underlying health conditions, and in the absence of any dreadful accidents, I don't think anybody's in danger of dying. Which is not to say that were I the owner or the manager of a Premier League club and a player said, look, I have misgivings, I have a wife and family, and frankly, I'm scared to death about playing, then I think I'd respect that. And I think all employers, whether you've got a shop or a factory or whatever, I think they're going to respect individual views. But I don't think, from what I see of the figures so far, that anybody's life is in danger if the whistle blew and we revived the Premier League football season in any league. I I think, you know, the stadiums have been sanitized, protocols will be observed, and I think we have a relatively safe environment. Not an absolutely 100% safe environment, but no sport ever does have that kind of environment.
David, your thoughts?
I agree. You know, we've become a very risk-averse society, and the idea that when there was a train crash, I can't remember the name, and 4 people died. We then spent about £10 billion on the railways. Whereas 4 people die in car crashes every day of the week. The problem, as I said earlier, is now that we're locked in our caves, so to speak, and we've been scared to death, it's going to be very difficult to get people to accept that, there is a low risk for most of the people. So yeah, no, I don't really have any more to add on that. I think we've got to leave it up to the individual to a large extent. We should be looking to shelter those who are at risk and advise those who are at risk to stay indoors and take the important considerations to keep themselves healthy. But the young sports playing population should be educated on the facts and be left to make up their own minds. Absolutely agree. This season, if a Premier League player doesn't want to play, then I think it's probably right to give them that choice. But ultimately, if you're picking up £100,000 a week and you're not playing, that creates a very difficult issue for the club. And one of the mismatches here is players' wages. The players have signed long-term contracts with no consideration in those contracts as to whether they're actually playing any matches or not. Whereas the income of the clubs is purely dependent on whether they play any matches. So there's a huge mismatch there. And so if that can't be corrected, clubs will go bust. So they either have to play matches or they have to reduce their wage bill, or a combination of both.
Let me ask you a follow-on from that point. Within Matthew Said's article, if you take it to its logical conclusion and paraphrasing him, I think he's implying, maybe even states this quite clearly in the article, been a couple of hours since I've looked at it, is that the virus is going to be with us for months. If that's the case, should players who are opposed to return, and some of them have been quite vocal about it, those players that are opposed to return, should they consider their future in the game? So by implication, they either take part in the games or they seek an alternative career. What do you think, David?
I wouldn't be quite as forthright as that, but there certainly comes a point where that is the case. I wouldn't say it is immediately now, because once a majority of players go back, and the majority of players will want to play, you'll find quite quickly, when it's seen that they're not dropping like flies, that the rest of the players will want to go back as well. But ultimately, they're being paid to play. And Ellis is right. Every sport has risks. Football is probably one of the least risky sports out there. My kids play cricket and hockey, which are more dangerous. And if you look at things like equestrian or boxing, they're even more dangerous. So football is quite a low risk game to begin with. So yeah, if they're earning 100,000, 200,000, whatever the figure is per week, and they're not prepared to play, then there'll come a point where they won't be paid. That might be the end of their contracts. I don't see how the clubs can terminate it under the way it's worded. But then, actually, I'm not a lawyer, so I suspect if the matches are being played and the player doesn't have a legitimate reason not to play, then they will eventually be terminated, as in contractually.
Just going to move the conversation on a little bit. There's been a lot of discussion in the press, and I know that Premier League have had extensive meetings about it, consulting with the clubs about neutral venues. That seems to be an idea which is on the back burner now. It's going to be scrapped. That's despite, the Deputy Chief Constable for UK's football policing unit saying clubs opposed to neutral grounds should get a grip. Well, I think we can recognise that home advantage is significant. Ellis, question for you regarding fans attending grounds.
Yeah.
can fans think for themselves? Can they be trusted to stay 2 meters apart? Seems a stupid question, but can we trust them to do that?
Probably not at the moment, because it's such an unfamiliar thing to do. But this is where I think the responsibility has to shift to the clubs themselves, because they are the professional organization and they are responsible for their fan behavior ultimately. So I don't think it's beyond the scope of any club to reorganize its stadium so that, for example, there is a vacant row in front and behind and a vacant seat either side. And it would mean reducing capacity, obviously, but that's maybe what everybody's calling the new normal. And I don't think that this is so different from the point that we were just discussing, because maybe we're just going to have to live with this virus. This is not something that, the vaccine isn't going to arrive gift wrapped in September, as a lot of people are assuming. It might do, but on the other hand, we may never get a vaccine. So we may just have to find a sustainable way of living in the presence of not just the COVID virus, but the ones that will almost certainly follow it. There are going to be other viruses that will be unwelcome presences in all of our lives, certainly for the rest of my life and probably for the rest of the lives of many of our viewers. So maybe we should be thinking not about a stopgap and how we're going to get out of lockdown, but how we might think in terms of next year, the year after, the future generally, and how we might accommodate the presence of these viruses in our everyday lives. Now, I don't think that this is going to require a drastic reformulation of the way we live, but it will need some kind of accommodation. And maybe, if it can be conclusively proven that this virus and viruses to come do jump across spaces rather than transmitted by touch or on surfaces, etc. Then maybe we're just going to have to sanitize our environments and watch our proximity to other people and just live that way. And football is part of society and it will have to adjust accordingly. But my feeling is that perhaps this is the way we should already be thinking rather than what we will do short term. But inevitably, football doesn't always think long term. And I don't blame the owners of football clubs, by the way, at the moment. They're thinking about how they can, get the cash registers ringing again. So, and I really don't blame them. I can see what they're doing here. But longer term, were I advising a football club, I'd be saying, I think the days of 40 and 60,000 people in your stadium are over. I think we're probably going to be looking at, 25,000 tops, something like that, because we do need the spaces.
David, what are the implications from a broadcaster's perspective in terms of, I guess for many broadcasters, the crowd and the atmosphere created by the crowd and the dynamic that's there is an integral part of the broadcast. Well, what's your perspective in terms of limiting that due to social distancing?
Well, I imagine we all saw some of those football matches that were played behind closed doors before lockdown. They were interesting for about 5 minutes because you can hear the players kind of shouting at each other. But after that, it resembles a bit of a park kick around, albeit with very good players. There's no doubt without that passion of the crowd, the viewing experience isn't the same. And I suspect the playing experience isn't the same either, because are the players quite as motivated without that crowd behind them? We talked about home advantage. That is the crowd. Without the crowd, is there actually a home advantage? Anyway, from a broadcasting experience, it was it's always been the case in the past that if the stadium's not full, the viewer sort of thinks, well, why should I watch this? Because if they can't even fill the stadium out, why should I be interested in that? So it was always key, even if you filled half the stadium, to make the stadium look full. Now, I'm sure there's people working on some very clever technical fixes right now through use of virtual reality, etc., to make the stadiums look full on screen, to pipe in crowd noise, etc. I don't know what they will be like, but they're bound to mitigate the effect to an extent. And as you know, if this does become the new normal, then it will get better over time as people spend a lot of money on it. You know, what the Premier League brings in, I think it's about 1.7, 1.8 billion pounds a year. If improving the atmosphere costs 100 million, it's money well spent, because without that atmosphere, I would say, you know, all other things being equal, that value falls by a reasonable percentage. The challenge for Sky with the Premier League, having, and nobody knows the figures, but I'm sure they've hemorrhaged subscribers over this period. It's presenting a compelling enough proposition that A, brings those subscribers back, and B, hangs on to the ones that have paused their subscription and otherwise haven't turned off. It's got to be attractive in this age of, a high action, low attention span drama stroke sport. Watching 90 minutes in an empty stadium might work for a couple of weeks, but will it work over a season? I think that remains to be seen.
Ellis, your thoughts? Football behind closed doors. I know that in terms of the global TV audience, the number of people physically in a stadium makes up less than 1% of the global TV audience. Take on board David's points about the atmosphere and the dynamics and the appeal of the product if it doesn't have that in the background. But you wrote extensively with your colleagues in Screen Society about the way the world's changing in terms of how we consume things. Is football behind closed doors that bad a scenario, in your opinion?
I don't think it's that bad. I agree with David that it's something that we're not used to, and it's something that will perhaps detract from the overall entertainment value of not just football but any sport. That's, if you watch it in a vacuum, there's something missing, and what's missing is, of course, the crowd. But as a species, we do adapt to changing environments. And if that's the only way we can consume football, two things can happen. One is that we just get used to it and just think, well, the crowd noise was nice, but it's not essential. We're actually watching the game itself. Or two, we just turn off football and don't think that football has any kind of divine right to be perennially popular. It looked to be in terminal decline in the 1980s, for example, and obviously it turned its fortunes around following the Hillsborough disaster. So, I mean, we could return to the kind of period where crowds dwindle and the broadcasters turn away from football and it goes into a period of decline. It could happen. I'm not saying it will, but certainly, I think David's given me some interesting raw data to try and think through this issue. Because if you did take the crowd away, would people still maintain their interest? I think they would initially, but longer term, 1 year, maybe 2 seasons, 3 seasons. There is this kind of sterility about watching the sport without atmosphere, and that could just tip the balance, and people might just go off the sport completely. We're into speculative fiction now, though.
David, in terms of kind of an extension of that, my impression is that esports haven't really grasped the opportunity that's being created by this void that's being created at the moment. How do you see esports evolving, and is it a bit of a missed commercial opportunity for esports organisations in terms of where we are currently?
One of the interesting things about this crisis is that I think it's accelerated trends that were there already, but they've been moved on. Online shopping is a really good example, or video calling is another example. Direct to home video, OTT, delivered through OTT platforms such as Netflix is that's clearly being pushed by this as well. Esports was a trend that's been growing quite rapidly pre-lockdown, but from obviously a a minuscule base. And the feeling was very much that it would appeal to particularly younger audiences that aren't necessarily interested in watching live sport. Like you, I would have expected a lot of the voids in the live sport schedule to be filled by esport properties. And there's been one or two around, but unless I've missed it, we certainly haven't been overwhelmed by them. The broadcasters seem to prefer to fill those gaps with sports documentaries, some of which have been very good, but that only has a limited life because once we've watched them all, then what? So I'm surprised esports haven't made more of the opportunity, whether that's through lack of trying or organisation, or whether the broadcasters simply haven't been interested. I don't know. Long term, I think that there's something to esports. I'm probably not the generation that fully appreciates them. However, with a young sports mad son, he doesn't watch esports. He's more interested in playing them himself than watching it. And the challenge for capturing that kind of audience is how you package the content up rather than what the content actually is. And it's about that short form digital content, which is easy to watch and can be watched at any point, as opposed to live sport, in my view. So to cut a long answer short, I think esport has missed an opportunity, but whether it's the sport of the future or whether it's simply live sport with an esport style virtual crowd, I would probably lean more towards the latter.
Alice, your thoughts on esports?
I'm not sure if it's a missed opportunity or whether it's just, esports has reached its kind of capacity. In other words, it's been in a tremendous spike for the past 2 or 3 years. And it's reached its height of popularity. It's very popular now, and it'll just either maintain that or maybe dwindle a little bit over the coming years. But I don't see any direct comparison, I have to say. I know they're both sports, but they're played very differently. Any kind of sport that involves swiping and tapping doesn't strike a guy from my generation as a sport. But then again, people, I do accept chess is a sport. So there's a certain kind of dexterity and intellectual capacity involved in esports. But no, it certainly hasn't rushed into the void, and I don't sense there's any kind of great appetite for it. But then again, I don't sense that there's much of a huge appetite for sports anyway at the moment. You mentioned one of my books earlier, and one of the chapters in Making Sense of Sport starts with what would a world without sport look like? And I try to imagine what our world would be like if we had no such thing as sports, which, as we pointed out earlier, is a meaningless pursuit anyway. It doesn't actually do anything for the betterment of society. And of course, I didn't think when I wrote that chapter that it would ever come true. And yet here we are. We've been a couple of months without sport. And has the world turned on its axis? I don't sense anything profound that's changed. People
they're about
it, aren't they? They're not all sort of saying, well, what are we doing? What are we doing? We're not eating. We're not cannibalizing each other. We're getting on with life and just thinking, well, there are other things that we need to attend to before sport. So this has been a kind of a chastening moment for sport. It ain't that important after all.
David, I want to ask you a question about there's some rumours circulating at the moment that Premier League clubs are facing a £340 million TV refund, even if the season resumes. I know you're not a lawyer, but can broadcasters legitimately ask for a refund? And if so, how should the Premier League respond to that in terms of negotiation, I guess?
Yeah, no, the broadcasters can, because the Premier League will have committed to provide so many matches over a certain schedule. So even if they provide those matches out, if it's outside the agreed schedule, that affects the impact. So, for instance, Sky, by the Premier League, to run from when is it, August to May. They have other content that runs in the summer. They got Formula One, they got cricket, etc. So they're looking to build a portfolio of different sports rights that allows them to keep the subscriber interested across the course of the year. So I can see Sky making that argument that without Premier League in its normal slots, they should get a refund. I think they're also arguing that with Premier League, without the atmosphere, without the crowds, that's not the same property. Therefore, they should get some sort of refund as well.
Are Sky actually arguing that, David?
As I understand it from the press, I've got no direct involvement in negotiations. The interesting thing for me, there will be a debate over refunds. I think other sports will suffer far more than Premier League, because Premier League is, or has been up until now, much watched TV. If you stick it on in June or July, particularly when people aren't going away on holiday, they'll still watch it. So if I was the Premier League, I'd be arguing that as long as we deliver the number of games we should be delivering, then there shouldn't be a reduction. And that's a negotiation that the two of them will have. The thing to bear in mind is, obviously, it's not just about this season or next season. It's about a long-term relationship between the Premier League and Sky. Sky have been there since the very beginning of the Premier League. And we saw in the past, when BT outbid Sky for the majority of packages, the Premier League still came back to Sky and gave them a second chance to outbid BT, the first time BT appeared on the scene. So that relationship is important. If I were the two parties, I would be looking at potentially paying the same, if I was Sky, potentially paying the same amount of money, but how do I then defer that out over a longer cycle, which potentially might include an extension to my rights. As it is at the moment, the Premier League were due to launch their next rights process by the end of this year. I can't see that happening. That's only year 2 of the 3-year deal, which is when they normally do it. So they could delay it by up to a year, really, if they wanted to. The rules for that tender, you may or may not recall, were drawn off the back of the European Commission complaint, and had to be agreed with the European Commission, which included such things as one broadcaster can't own all the packages, there has to be a second one. Now, of course, we're not in the EU anymore, so does that European Commission ruling even matter anymore? The interesting question for me is, what's to stop Sky, BT and the Premier League sitting down and saying, right, well, we'll pay you the same money, but we're going to reschedule it as part of an extension of the deal for, say, another 2 years. If I was the Premier League, I'd be looking at that very carefully, because I can't see the rights market recovering for the next couple of years anyway. I think it's going to take a massive hit. So if you can reach an agreement where I maintain, or my income to a certain level over that uncertain next 2 years, I'd bite your hand off.
But the implication of what you're saying is quite interesting when you think about it, because Sky, of course, now is owned by Comcast, which is an American company, who may not be so enthusiastic about association football as Sky was under the Murdoch family. If you're right, though, I mean, it sounds extremely plausible to me. It could mean that there would be a quite dramatic reduction in income. If the broadcaster said, we're not going to give you the same kind of money that you've been used to. This is a different game now, and we're in the driver's seat. And now you're coming to us with the begging bowl because you're not giving us the product that we thought we were getting. The glamorous, glitzy, atmospheric content. We're not getting that anymore. We're getting something much more sanitized and sterile in a different kind of environment. And that isn't as valuable to us because our subscribers are now pulling out. So we're going to give you less money. That means less money for the Premier League, which would mean less money for the clubs, which would mean either a drastic reduction in wages or a transformation of the Premier League so that they would be, a much more modest league than the one that we're used to. So there'd be a kind of self-perpetuating downward spiral. But I'm being a prophet of doom, but you put the seeds of doubt in my mind.
Can I come back on that? And there's no one sitting here with a crystal ball able to say, what will the sports rights market look like in 6 months' time? Anyone who claims to know that, is slightly delusional when we don't know what's going to happen in 3 weeks' time. Saying that, the Premier League, the rights where they are now is many times greater than they were, say, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And it's not just the Premier League that will face these issues. It's all the other European leagues, across the board, possibly even more so.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the market for footballers is a competitive one between not only the clubs in England, but the other major footballing playing countries. So income could well come down, but I think it would come down across the board. And it's the players ultimately who will have to take lower wages as they take higher wages when the money goes up. I don't think it will affect the product in any way. What will affect the product far more is whatever the social distancing rules happen to be and how that happens to be broadcast going forward. But the football has always been a game of equilibrium. Basically, money in goes to the players. So whatever money comes in, ultimately, the adjustment will be to what the players get paid.
That was the point. That that if you can't attract the players with the money, then we have a more modest game.
But they have nowhere else to go. They're not going to become cricketers.
We don't know what broadcasters are going to be doing in other parts of the world. We just don't know.
Yeah, but the world pretty much, if you're looking at the main European markets, which are the competitors for the Premier League players, they're all suffering. Now, you could see maybe the Germans, relatively speaking, the Germans will increase. Italy and Spain have been hit harder than the UK. But the Germans are starting from and I don't have the figures to hand, but from a much lower base to begin with than the Premier League. So it may well be the German league ends up being, richer than the Premier League, but it's not going to be by enough to radically change the product.
But David, the point, I've got China in mind here, rather than other European powers. I'm thinking of China.
Yeah, but then we're talking about kind of long-term geopolitical trends, which, absolutely, China's going to end up owning the world, and there's probably not very much we can do about that. But that's probably a longer-term issue than you may find the Chinese start wanting to buy the Premier League, and do you get to a position where the Premier League starts having teams outside of England, for instance? I'll just throw that one into the pot, but I suspect we don't have time to discuss that.
Well, there's 1,000 more questions we could ask, but I'm probably going to finish on this one before we go to Tim for questions from people who are out there in the audience. Is in terms of, I know you both haven't got a crystal ball, but how do you think, Ellis, I'll address this to you first. Ellis, how do you think professional sports are going to emerge from this experience? You can take that in whatever direction you want to address it from. How are professional organizations going to interact? What are they going to be doing in terms of their product? Because I think, as David's just touched on, value has definitely changed in the marketplace, and that's dynamic, and whether it goes up or down in the near future, we don't know. But how are professional sports organizations going to emerge from this?
Well, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to this. I think some sports could deal with it quite handily. Boxing, for example, I don't think it'd take much more, in terms of physical reconfiguration of the halls in which boxing is held. football we've dealt with. Cricket again, you know, a little bit different, but it couldn't adjust its state. But the more I think through this, the less of a problem it becomes for me, because as I mentioned, a few moments ago, I think that what we will be looking for very shortly is a sustainable future rather than what we do in the short term. And that will mean making long-term changes to the way we consume sport. You alluded to this earlier, and it's, you're right, I've written about it, but didn't speak much about it today. But these are the things that people consume sports through a lot more nowadays, but they consume everything through the phones and the tablets anyway. And maybe this will kind of accelerate the trend towards that. People will be content, instead of going to football matches, to sit at home with the phones and just look at it, or gathered around in a pub and look at it that way. I'm wriggling out of this answer.
David, put you on the hook as well.
I think there's the potential for a profound change in sports, across the different sports. I suspect football at the elite level and some of the other, what I would call premium broadcast sports, such as Formula One, such as cricket, principally driven by India, of course, will continue to, the players will continue to do very well at that elite, club or international level. I'm concerned about the clubs further down the tree and the sports further down the pecking order, which are very reliant on ticket revenue, where already there was a trend towards falling broadcast revenue for these smaller club straight sports. And if you take ticket revenue out of the mix, which looks like will be the case for the foreseeable future, what happens to those sports? We've seen that League 1 and 2 in the Football League have shut up for the season, and I read something today about how they might not reopen without crowd income. They're not economically viable. You look at all the Olympic sports, which have in this country have risen off the back of lottery money, but also rely on a huge amount of money from the IOC, which, who knows whether there'll even be an Olympics next year. So therefore there's no income coming in from there. So, I think there's going to be an adjustment over the next year or two. The quicker the adjustment, I suspect the healthier those sports that do adjust quicker will be in the long term. But I can see, we've been in this world for the last, say, 15 years of super commercialization that's ridden off the back of rising TV revenues, where if you play a sport, it's a livelihood. I'm personally asking some questions about whether all of these sports will be able to remain professional, whether some of them need to go back to more semi-professional eras where you need a job as well as playing that sport. And you can see that lower league football, you could see that at county cricket level, you can see that with Olympic sports. I think that could be the consequence for sports. And that might not necessarily be a bad thing, by the way, taking some of the commercialism out of sport, because ultimately it gets back to my original question: what is sport all about? Is it about players earning lots of money, or is it about health and well-being and participation, etc., which is a really interesting ethical question.
It's a good point to finish on. Thanks, David. Thanks, Alice. Tim, are you there in the background? Have you got some questions from the audience?
Yes, I have. Thanks, Ian. Really interesting debate, and what a poignant topic just to cap it off. It was very good. In the context of time, I think we have run over slightly. I know that Andy has got a question he wants to bring on. I'm just going to introduce Andy and unmute him so he can ask his question. Andy, are you there?
Good afternoon, gents. Yeah, I've got to take really, really strong issue with what were really, I thought, depressing observations and comments. I think you failed to recognise, Ellis in particular, when you dismiss sport, I think you dismiss it on two levels. I think you failed to recognise the crucial place it figures in the culture of so many of our great communities. Football isn't just about the dollar, although that's clearly important, but it frameworks so many people's lives. You've only got to win an Ashes series and Trafalgar Square is rammed with people celebrating. British people will celebrate winning curling in the Olympics. Sport is at the fabric of so many of our communities. So I think that we are arrogant and disdainful to dismiss its value to people. People's lives are defined by it in many respects. So that's on one level. The other question I'd ask you is on an economic level, do you know the number that is recognised as coming into HMRC from sport? Sorry, from football. Sorry, not from sport, from football. I'll tell you, £3.3 billion comes into the coffers of HMRC on the back of sport, football and associated activities. So I think on an emotional level, sports can be the catalyst for bringing this society out of lockdown, out of the virus. On an economic level, I think it's going to be even more critical than ever. I acknowledge, David, what you were saying about sports rights and the potential challenge around those and the impact for championship clubs downwards. But I think that the Premier League, when it returns, the challenge will be to Sky from the likes of Amazon and the success that we've seen with people pay-per-view. You could see every football match now being broadcast and the revenues going direct through to the Premier League. So I really think that the doomsday scenario that's been painted is wide of the mark.
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
I think there are about 3 questions there. I'll start with the last one. I wasn't saying there was a doomsday scenario for football. I think football will shape up a lot better than most other sports. What I was saying is across the board, I think there are issues around income and how sustainable those sports are when you take crowd income, ticket income out of it. The Amazon question's an interesting one. Amazon aren't actually making any money at the moment. There's this belief, because of lockdown, Amazon is absolutely coining it in. They're doing very well in certain areas, but they're not doing so well in their bog standard. I feel like buying something, I'll just buy a package business. They're doing very well on the content side. They're doing very well delivering essentials, but the run-of-the-mill package business, it is not doing as well. I think Amazon will look at, the jury's out a little bit whether Amazon want to hoover up content. And if they do, I suspect they'll pay the price that it's worth rather than looking to outbid significantly the likes of Sky. So, there's no doubt football is a primary driver of pay TV, OTT, any type of content. So there'll always be a good value on that, and I'm not disputing that. So there will always be a decent value on the Premier League, and the players will always get paid well relative to other content. But overall, I think the value will come down just because if the economy falls by a third, then values automatically will fall. Advertising revenues will be down by 50% or something at the moment. Subscriber revenues will fall if fewer people subscribe. So I agree with you to a point there. As far as the culture of sport, your first point, I absolutely agree with you. And if I didn't make myself clear how passionately I believe about sport is the fabric of our society, talking about grassroots sports, etc., I apologise. I absolutely think it's central to our culture. And as I said, sport is a central part of our economy. So I agree with your second point there. What is the meaning of life at the end of the day? We all have different things that get us up in the morning, and for a lot of people that is sport, including myself, by the way. It's not just, life is not just about getting up, eating and going, working and going to bed, which is kind of what lockdown has forced upon us. I disagree when Ellis said, "Oh, we haven't had sport and we haven't really missed it." I think a lot of people, myself included, have missed it greatly. It's not because people don't want sport, it's because it hasn't been available. If you got rid of all the sports in the world, then people would invent new ones, because I think it's part of our DNA to want to play sport and compete against each other. So I agree with you, 100% on those first 2 points. And on the third one, I think the Premier League will be in a decent place relative to every sport, but there's going to be a natural market correction.
Okay. So, Ellis, did you want to respond to that, or shall we?
I will briefly. Listen, nobody is arguing about the economic value of sport, and in particular, the Premier League. It does generate a lot of income, and that income, and a good portion of that income goes to HMRC in tax. So, I'd be an idiot to argue otherwise. The question, though, was put to me, and I'm always careful in listening to questions. Is sport important in the greater scheme of things? And I answered that question. And I still stand by my answer. In the greater scheme of things, it isn't about life and death. There are a great many other much more important things in sport. Sport is not going to bring peace on earth. It's not going to provide a solution to our environmental problems. It isn't going to help us find a cure for cancer. The bedeviling problems of this world are not addressed by sport, which is not to underestimate how important we believe subjectively sport is, and how much we organize a lot of our emotional as well as cultural lives about sport. It is part of British culture. And, I write about these things. I earn a living in part through writing about these things. So I'm the last person to want to deny it. But I'll go back to my first point. It was the way the question was phrased that I answered.
Okay, I accept that. I still think you underestimate the value to your average man in the street.
Well, to some men and some women, for that matter. But I don't have an answer to this, and I'm hoping you're going to have a guess. What percentage of the people out there in the population at the moment do you think care passionately about football in particular? I don't have an answer, but you may.
My guess would be 80%.
Oh, no. 8 out of every 10 people care passionately about football.
Well, care. Let's say care.
All right. Watch football.
Yeah.
Watch football, whether on TV or in a stadium. You think 8 out of 10 people are that interested in football?
You get in a taxi in Belarus and ask the driver.
Well, I'm talking about in the UK at the moment, though.
No, Belarus is probably the wrong choice. You get in a taxi in a forgotten African state and mention David Beckham, and the guy will pull out a shirt from behind his bag with the player's name on it. I think you massively underestimate. Clearly, there's a difference between people who go to a game every week and people who.
Yeah, you're picking on a weak spot with Beckham, because Beckham is
my 84-year-old mother-in-law watches every game of football that comes on her TV. She hasn't been to a game for 2 or 3 years, but for her, when she arrives at a house in Portugal, she talks to the taxi driver about football. Guess what? He knows everything that's happening in the Premier League. You talk to the waiter, they know everything in the Premier League. So football, I think, really is, first of all, I think it's uplifting at a time of deep trouble. And I think as sport starts again, it will be a catalyst for the rejuvenation of our society. And I think, yes, 80% of people do care about football.
Can I just jump in here? It's Tony. In answer to your question there, Ellis, I can't put a number on it, but I think the answer is actually all over the, well, I'll come back to you in a minute, David. I think the answer is all over the media today. So Greater Manchester Police are all over the media today, and they've come out challenging the decision to play at grounds all over the country, purely down to the fear that fans are going to turn up to the ground. They can't get in the ground, but they're going to turn up to the ground.
Yeah.
In answer to how, to how important football potentially is to people, the police and the policymakers themselves fear that even without fans being able to get in the ground, they're going to turn up. So that gives you an indication.
They turn up rather than watch it on TV.
That gives you an indication of the power of football in society.
Well, 2 points. To be fair, there's not much else in the news. So, it's very, very slow in the news. And I think that kind of story probably wouldn't, in the normal scheme of things, make it into the big news. I just believe that we who are involved, engaged in sport in some capacity, and all of us are, we tend to get involved in it so intensely that we forget there are a lot of people out there who are completely out of sympathy with sport, who are just irritated every time, their favorite soap is interrupted by a live game, and are just bored by sport. And they just don't get it. We do, but I try to look at it, from as many different perspectives as possible. And I think that, yes, I agree, you can get in a cab anywhere in the world and strike up a conversation. I've done it myself, so we all know that's very true. But I still think, we exist in a bubble, and it's a big bubble, admittedly. But I think sometimes we have to take stock of the fact that there is a world outside sport, and they just don't like sport. They're just simply not. I'm guessing we all come from sporty families in one, in some sense. So we all had it kind of built into us that sport is good and something we should follow and participate in, and it's a lifelong interest. But there are simply a lot of people out there who are not interested in sport, I think.
Can I just make a point? I'll ask a question. I just want to build on the back of it. I just think that, your understanding of social sciences and behavioural sciences is phenomenal. It's well known and documented in many different languages. As a basic human need, it's one of our fundamental needs to be competitive. We don't know where we get it from, but we do. We have this innate nature to be competitive. We make a joke about two.
I don't think we do.
Absolutely, we do. We're competitive against ourselves, and we're competitive against other people. The
nature, though.
I'm fair. They stand corrected, but I would love to have a debate. I'd love to challenge this and have a chat this more at a time. But an innate ability comes through, being able to stand up and walk. If we fell over and we weren't competitive, we'd stop and we wouldn't do it again. We'd get up and walk because we want to be able to achieve things.
I don't call that
achievement. I don't know. There's an innate driver that is at a subconscious level that you would have to agree that drives us forward. Otherwise,
let's take to walk. We don't. Our parents teach us to walk. They hold us up and they assist us and they get us walking. That isn't competitive. That's just how we learn to be human beings.
But you're not competitive when you fall over to get up and try again.
Not necessarily. That is a competition. That's adapting to your environment.
What's adapting to your environment if it's not to progress?
That isn't competition, though.
Well,
have you looked?
Rivalries, people, two or more people going after the same resource. And I know a lot of people will say that we are naturally competitive animals. And I know it's very popular, and it looks like we are. But I don't think we are really, because societies are built on cooperation, much more so than competition. And people put this to me time and again. They say, sport is a great preparation for life because it makes you competitive. It makes you grit your teeth. It gives you character. It gives you that determination to want to succeed. And I say, well, society isn't like that. It's not cutthroat. People are not trying to beat each other all the time. We cooperate.
Is it not about being better than you were? Is that not competitive with yourself? Is that just, or is that defined under progress? Is that different?
Progress is a relative concept, I think, and quite different from competition, because it means you are progressing in a series of stages. You're advancing towards something, whether it be a goal, an ambition, an ideal. You are making steps towards something. Now, it can be, of course, in an FA competition, each round you succeed in is a progression towards the final and ultimately winning the trophy. So it can be, but I think they're two distinct processes.
Well, then would you agree that if progress is then left-brained or logical, sequential, would you agree that then the emotion and the passion and the drive of that we call competition is then a right-brain thing? So completely together, you have the complete package. You know where I'm going with this?
You're trying to push me into psychology, and I have a well-documented loathing for psychologists because I think that teaches absolutely nothing. But did you cut me off then?
Oh, no, not at all. Someone was asking a question. No, not at all. No, listen, I would love to. I'd love to say that.
We're into deep conceptual waters here, and I'd love to wade further. Suffice it to say that I believe that competition is something that we learn. I'm a sociologist, though, so I would say that. We learn practically everything that we are. Everything is a product of our environment, of who we interact with, how we're taught, the institutions we move through, and to use one of your terms, how we progress through the life phases. And I think all the time we are accumulating behavioral habits, intellectual know-how, and that's what makes us human beings, not what we're born with in our DNA.
The flip side of your coin comes from my wife, who is a child psychologist, and she would say, if you need to know she's just come into the room behind me because she was listening to the conversation. If you really need to know about competitiveness and sport, she said, go and stand in a school playground for half an hour and watch just how competitive 7-year-olds. It's not taught, it's not learned, it's innate, and their passion is there, and their passion is for sport, and it's what gets them through the day, be it the lunch break or after school. They want to go and play sport.
Teachers just said we're not having competitive sports. Would you remove the passion? Would you remove the kind of liveliness of the school kids? No, you'd rechannel it into a different kind of pursuit.
So you're saying it is innate then to have that need for pursuit?
No, I'm saying that they would, because they're taught. I'm not saying that children are complete blank slates. I'm sure that there are things that they find rewarding and punishing, regardless of what they taught. But what I'm saying that competition isn't one of them.
Wow.
So I'd love to debate in context of time. I know David had a point to make before, and then we're going to have to wrap it up, guys, because we are nearing an hour and a half. Maybe we can reschedule this and continue. Would be great.
Yeah, I'd just like to add on what we've just been discussing. I'm not going to get into the sociology at this point, but the research that we did when I was at the BBC around sports audiences, you can generally divide the country up into three. A third of people are what we used to call hardcore sports fans who will watch sport at any point of the year. A third of the country are what we used to call main eventers. So you get something like the Olympics, or you get something like the Euros or the World Cup, and they come into sport and enjoy it, as a social, national unifying event. And then a third of people have absolutely no interest in sport whatsoever. So you can, but that third that is absolutely passionate about it are absolutely passionate about it. And for them, it is one of the most important things in their life. So you could argue, what's the point of religion? That doesn't feed people or cure cancer or whatever. But for people who are religious, it's absolutely central to their life. And to people who are sport is central to their life. Is it any, maybe being slightly controversial here, but is any different to being religious?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's a great point to finish on. Ian, I know it's gone slightly over on this, but have you got any points just to clarify and just wrap this up? That would be superb.
I think it's been great to hear the opinions of David and Ellis. I don't know David very well, but having spoke to him a couple of days ago for a short amount of time, I was really looking forward to David's contribution, and it hasn't let me down. And Ellis I know a lot better, and Ellis, as usual, is forthright, highly insightful, and really engaging companies. So thanks very much to David and Ellis. It's been tremendous. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you, guys. Good night.
Thank you.
All right.
I know.
Cheers, guys.